It is my pleasure to introduce Heather Freeman for tonight's lecture. Heather Freeman is many things at once. Holds a Master of Fine Arts in Studio Art from Rutgers University and a BA in Fine Art and German Studies from Oberlin College. And she is indeed a productive artist in many different areas, with a special focus on animation, digital media, game design, and podcasts. You can find an overview of her artistic work on her website called heatherdfreeman.com. Heather is an experimental filmmaker. You can find, for instance, her project Film Shapes on YouTube if you're interested. She's a successful podcast producer and most recently finished the acclaimed podcast series Magic in the United States with 3 seasons and 18 episodes in total, for which she had received a huge grant from the National Endowment for Humanities, and this is the topic of today's talk, and I've also sent you some more information on this in an email. Heather is also a creative artist in the field of what we at KC have sometimes called esotericism, electronic esotericism. For instance, together with software engineer Chris Henry, she created a digital divination tool called Mosaic. You can also find this online. It's called mosaicdivination.com. So it's a very interesting online divination tool. The making of this divination tool comes, of course, out of her almost lifelong fascination with esoteric practices, and especially magic. And one of her most important research foci is to explore the intersections between modern digital media, on the one hand, and magic, mysticism, and religious expression on the other. So she practices what she studies and could therefore be considered a practitioner scholar or also a digital witch. So you would not neglect this title. And she has experimented with all sorts of digital and online rituals, some of which have even included AI-generated spirits. We could say this is the last cry in modern digital magic, is using AI-generated spirits, whatever spirit that means. In these explorations, she continuously attempts to integrate digital tools into her own magical and esoteric practice. All at the same time, Heather Freeman is since 2006 Professor of Art and Digital Media at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Since 2006, assistant, then 2011 associate, and since 2017, she's full professor. She's also the director of the Center for Magic, Esotericism, and Culture at UNC Charlotte, a currently unfunded pilot center and multidisciplinary research hub, which is dedicated to the scholarly exploration of esoteric knowledge and practices across diverse cultural and historical contexts. So here are obvious synchronicities to our center here. I first met Heather in 2023 in Berlin on the Culture Conference. And since then, we have also been cooking up something together, namely a new research network called GNASM, the Global Network for the Academic Study of Magic. And there's much more to talk about, given that her online CD has 58 pages. But I stop here and hand over the word to you, Heather. Welcome.
First, thank you, everybody, for inviting me back, for the directors and staff and everyone at KC. I just really appreciate being here. It means a lot to talk to you all today. So I'll try not to bore you. When I wrote the abstract for this talk several months ago, things felt a little different in the United States, but very euphemistically. I wrote that scholars of magic and esotericism advocate for nuanced understandings of religious, spiritual, and magical diversity. And these topics are relevant to diverse academic disciplines and lay audiences. And I wrote that scholars are often confronted by stigmas stemming from religious conservatism, nationalist ideologies, and cultural bias. Well, this turns out would be personally applicable in short order. So I'll start by bringing you up to speed on some current events. I'm going to try to be objective about some things that have been social political in the US right now, but objectivity has its limits. So on December 22nd, 2024, Representative Paul Rand, a Republican from Kentucky, released the 10th edition of his annual Festivus report on government waste. On page 24 of my NEH-funded podcast series from PRX, Magic in the United States, was cited as one such example of wasted taxpayer dollars. The document states the following: behold, dear taxpayer, your hard-earned money is disappearing faster than you can say. 3-season podcast series exploring how magical practices and beliefs have evolved in the United States from the 1600s to the present. Thanks to the visionary minds of the National Endowment for the Humanities, NEH, in cooperation with the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, we can revel in the mystifying podcast Magic in the United States. For the astonishing price of $388,863, you can now enjoy the 6-episode per season deep dive into magic. Unfortunately, this isn't the kind of magic that will fix our roads or lower our taxes. Or I would add, move to a single payer. Just the usual bureaucrats making your money disappear with a wave of their hands. When it comes to solving 21st century problems, there's nothing more relevant than witches, shamans, and some guy waving a wand somewhere in colonial New England. Each episode promises to take us on a magical historical roller coaster through the spells, superstitions, and magical religious movements of America's history. There's some inaccuracies in there. I'm not going to bother with them, but all right. A grant of almost $400,000 is a lot of money, right? I'm not on that. And I consider myself a fiscal conservative. This media projects production grant from the National Endowment for Humanities covered my salary for 1 year, plus a class, plus benefits, overhead for the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, very, very modest stipends for 9 of the humanities advisors, and PRX's subcontract, which was roughly $230,000. PRX produced, distributed, and also marketed the podcast. Looking over the other projects on this page of the Festivus report, it's clear that someone simply searched the word magic under federal expenses and listed any projects that included this keyword. It's unlikely anyone in Representative Paul's office actually listens to the podcast. While it's critical academics advocate for the research to lay audiences, we cannot force them to listen to our works. And we'll get into that in a little bit. We can only try to justify why it's worthwhile, why what we do is important to and relevant to the lived realities of everyday citizens. And our research is important to the lived realities of everyday citizens. So we'll come back to this. But back to politics, because again, some context is useful. Representative Rand Paul is a ranking member of the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, which is the Senate's primary oversight committee with broad jurisdiction over governmental operations generally and the Department of Homeland Security in particular. This committee itself has a fascinating history, dating back to 1816, and includes involvement both with Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist hearings as well as the Watergate scandal. Super fascinating history, different topic. Rand's own personal political career has largely been focused on fiscal conservatism and reduction of wasteful spending. Over the decades, however, these efforts have been increasingly aligned with social conservative movements. He is among Senate members who have supported the false claim that the 2020 US presidential election was stolen. I cannot emphasize this enough. This disinformation has been so damaging to my nation. And I would argue other nations as well, in short order. He is of the opinion that marriage must be between a man and a woman, abortion should be illegal except in highly restricted circumstances, and generally mirrors many of President-elect Donald Trump's policies, although not universally. Again, his primary platform has been, and continues to be, eliminating what he considers wasteful federal spending. Whether his increasing alignment with social conservatism is utilitarian or for purely sincere moral reasons, I can't assess, and that's better territory for political studies scholars. However, the rhetoric around stolen elections, the dehumanization of LGBTQ+ community members, the criminalizing language used to assess immigrants and migrants, women's loss of bodily autonomy, and the pushback against efforts to improve equity broadly for communities of color. These are monumental things that we've been working for over the 20th century and our 21st century, and anybody who understands 20th century global political history knows that this is a frightening moment. From a religious studies perspective, the reference to Festivus is in the report is really amusing. How many of you know what Festivus is? Anybody? Oh, this is great. You'll have to watch some Seinfeld. All right. In 1997, an episode of Seinfeld introduced the idea of Festivus to popular audiences. This is a secular holiday celebrated on December 23rd that is an alternative to commercialism and social pressures of the Christmas holiday season. This is amusing in part because the holiday was conceived by the writer Daniel O'Keefe, the father of Dan O'Keefe, who co-wrote the Seinfeld episode. And I should say this is sort of in line with the flying spaghetti monster theology, right? So Festivus is a sort of joke holiday, but also kind of real. One of Daniel O'Keefe's best-known works, in fact, is his 1982 book, Stolen Lightning, The Social Theory of Magic, which is an interdisciplinary investigation of the role of magic in human societies, past and present, asserts that magic remains an important element in contemporary civilizations. So, of course, I'm sort of delighted to be included in a report on Festivus. At any rate, the mention of the podcast by a fiscally and socially conservative political report was not surprising, though still, for me personally, a little unsettling. But as national news items go, it was a blip on the radar. It was mentioned in a few minor conservative news outlets, then disappeared as the next items caught the airwaves. Most news outlets that cited magic in the United States simply quoted Paul's report with minimal fact-checking. So they repeated the same relative minor mistakes made in the original Festivus report. It's clear nobody listened to the podcast. And we saw a minor spike in downloads, but it was very minor. Then, less than a week after the Festivus report was released, it was out of the news again. And then, as I was boarding my plane to Munich, I got an email from my college alerting me to another news item that mentioned my podcast. And this was an altogether different animal. On January 8th, the Washington Stand wrote a detailed expose on magic in the United States. The content of this report is lengthy, thoroughly researched, and unlike the Festivus report, which it cites, quite accurate. It's clear the author, Ben Johnson, spent a lot of time either listening to individual podcast episodes or reading the transcripts. The report is scathing, however, because it claims that federal funds were used to, quote, promote the Church of Satan, paganism, and a Cuban cult that practices animal sacrifice, astrology, an LGBT-friendly school of witchcraft, and other magico-religious beliefs. Some of that's not quite right, but okay. Johnson goes on to write, the podcast claims it will expand the audience's understanding of magical beliefs and practices prevalent throughout recorded American history. The evolution of American magical beliefs and practices intersects with the nation's rich religious diversity, that he's quoting me. Instead, each episode advocates and promotes the occult practices in question, some of which the hostess, Heather Freeman, practices. The podcast website notes that Freeman has been fascinated by magic, witchcraft, religion, and spirituality since a kid. The show's producer, Amber C. Walker, double majored in gender, sexuality, feminist studies, and Africana studies at Oberlin College, and just happened to go to the same college as Andrew. Each episode promotes some form of paganism, occultism, or spiritual practice Christianity would regard as demonic. The essay goes on to give a detailed summaries of 13 of the 18 episodes, and as of January 13th, this content has been picked up and repeated, largely unchanged, by two other news sites. Prophecy News Watch, which they titled, When DEI Meets the Occult, your taxpayer-funded podcast promoting paganism, and also in WorldNet Daily by Bob Unruh. And his article is called, Work Magically with Non-Biblical Spirits. Biden Legacy now includes special cast to promote Satan. All of this crosses the line from full work. For the uninitiated, we need to understand the Washington Stand first. This is a news outlet for the Family Research Council, which is an activist group in Washington, D.C., who says its mission is to advance faith, family, and freedom in public policy and culture from a biblical worldview. Family Research Council is an overtly evangelical Christian nonprofit. Some watchdog groups have called it nationalist. I'll just leave it at evangelical Christian nonprofit. However, it has also been listed as an anti-LGBTQ+ hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. It also commended former President Trump's policies and his Supreme Court nominees, but has carefully never endorsed a candidate for president. What is most unsettling about the Washington Stand article is that it is largely accurate and detailed. Its summaries and quotes are true to the episodes and the transcripts. It accurately describes the guests. But it spins the podcast and its use of federal dollars as promoting practices we describe and report upon. Its spin on the podcast is not accurate. As far as this report is concerned, Speaking about these topics is the same as promotion. Talking about something is the same as promoting it. In American society, the adage, don't talk about sex, politics, or religion in polite company has become a defense mechanism rather than a method of avoiding conflict at wedding receptions. The very act of simply discussing historically objective events and practices is regarded as a social and political act and promotion of those practices. That's a very dangerous place to be in a country that values free speech. So what to do? How do you advocate for the value of research without advocating the practices described in that very same research? This is a false question. It's a false dichotomy because the entire intent is to shut down the discussion of those topics. So hopefully I made the case why communicating our research to lay audiences is extremely important. What we do is valuable. It enriches our lives. It helps foster understanding. And there's a movement, at least in the United States, to maybe discourage that. To discuss magic is a seriously risky topic. Why? Because in the industrialized North, magic is trapped between material rationalism and the myth of disenchantment. And, in the US at least, evangelical Christian fundamentalism. Indeed, to discuss history at all is impossibly political, in part because it's at some point you have to make editorial choices about what you want to talk about. What stories are you going to tell? And what stories are going to have to get cut out only because you don't have enough time. The biggest criticism from our regular listeners was that the episodes were simply too short. But these particular listeners were often practitioners. And we crafted this podcast series with others in mind, with friends, coworkers, family members who were not practitioners. We created this podcast to carve out space of inclusion and tolerance for people who are practitioners. To understand, to empathize, not just to tolerate, but to appreciate the existence of someone different from you. To value that they exist in the world and to realize that the world is richer for those differences. This is absolutely what I was trying to promote in Magic in the United States. I would totally own that. And in my opinion, this is the very heart of what it means to be a humanities scholar. The topic of magic is a rich territory for conveying the nuance of lived religious experiences in the United States, across many diverse communities and across a few short generations that make up our young nation. If I'd used federal funds to create a podcast series about evangelical Christianity in the US, maybe I wouldn't have been a target. Who knows? But it behooves us to step into the shoes of those who criticize this and to understand their objections as well. And yes, to empathize with them. So, going back, is someone telling a particular story? Why not? And what are the stakes of telling it? What are the stakes of not telling it? And for those of us who are old enough to remember the Satanic Panics, those stakes were real. Scholars of religion, esotericism, and magic often have to advocate for nuanced understandings of spiritual and cultural diversity. Indeed, all scholars must explain their research and often advocate for it, from the arts and humanities to STEM fields and social sciences. Scholars must advocate for both their individual research topics and not just in grant applications, but also they have to advocate it to other disciplines who might not understand the inherent value. This comes up in the tension between STEM fields and humanities and arts, for example. Again, it's another false dichotomy, but it's one that we foster ourselves, unfortunately. Explaining our research and advocating for it to lay non-academic audiences is sometimes viewed more as community service than as a research necessity. Yet scholars in many disciplines may confront stigma from lay audiences. There's some cultural nuance here, of course. In the US, academia is increasingly viewed as elitist, self-indulgent, and unnecessary. Unfortunately, some academics take this criticism as ignorant or personal attacks, rather than as perceptions that have evolved over time and that we scholars ourselves may have inadvertently encouraged some of this through a lack of direct communication. There is an art to explaining nuanced, complex topics with accurate language to non-scholar audiences. This requires leaving the jargon at home, explaining technical terms carefully and often, and never, ever talking down to your audiences. This is yet another soft skill academics need to adopt. Unfortunately, we're really busy. But I'd argue that scholarship that can clearly explain and justify to lay audiences can ultimately improve its own research output. If you've ever had the experience of complaining about a frustrating research question to a non-academic friend or family member, only to find the solution when you're trying to break down the problem in non-disciplinary terms, you know what I'm talking about. And I highly recommend it. Like my 16-year-old, not interested in any of the stuff that I do, but man, when I'm trying to break down a problem, I talk to him because he's super smart. He's like, Mom, calm down. The solution's right there. My background is in visual art. I'm trained to find connections between seemingly disparate things. My first podcast series, Familiar Shapes, started when I saw a poetic parallel between concepts of the early modern roots of familiar and the 2015 era social bot. This started out as a film. The pandemic froze my funding, and I pivoted and made a podcast instead. And I was hooked on the medium since then. Familiar Shapes targeted generalist audiences, and I often think of my in-laws as in these projects. My in-laws mostly are college educated, some don't, and they're all thoughtful and really good-hearted people. They're varying degrees of Catholic, descended from Italian and Irish Americans, and they live in a part of Ohio that is relatively limited in terms of cultural diversity. So with making Magic in the United States, I thought of them. I was making it for them. But also for my art department colleagues, for academics in STEM fields, and others who are well-educated, curious, but maybe are entrenched in a rigid form of material rationalism. Familiar Shapes demonstrated for me that there was room for more podcasts that conveyed humanities and social science research, specifically about magic, esotericism, and culture. To non-expert audiences, there's room for podcasts that are richly mixed. And I highly recommend both Radiolab for an example of this and also the 1619 project. A topic, however, is not the same as a story. And most of us understand complex topics best through storytelling. So each episode of Magic in the United States started with a broad topic. For example, initiatory Wicca. And then we drilled down to find an interesting story. In that case, the life and legacy of Eddie Kaczynski, who founded the Minoan Brotherhood. In some cases, like our episode hashtag Goodbye Books Only, which I think you all were recommended, we started with a fairly common popular cultural practice, such as manifesting something. I put air quotes, but I don't know why, and then reverse engineered the origins. These episodes were trickier to craft and often relied on contemporary soundbites from TikTok or from street interviews. But I would also say I think that particular episode is one of our most important for a lot of reasons. In all episodes, we try to find a balance between scholars and diverse humanities disciplines as well as practitioners. In most cases, we try to have more than one practitioner, since living practices are themselves often diverse in their expression. For both the entire series and for individual episodes, a team of humanities advisors from diverse disciplines and topics were essential to shaping the series as well as individual episodes. Of course, scholarly debates come up, that happens, I navigated it as best I could, and other times episodes became an opportunity to feature the research of a relatively new scholar, and in some cases graduate students. And of course, some scholars were practitioners themselves, which sometimes was relevant, sometimes not. The series concluded in mid-December 2024, and so there are still episodes being downloaded, but I do have some metrics that demonstrate that the series did extremely well, especially as new podcast series are often struggle to gain traction without being giant. Look, if I was a giant social media influencer, no problem, but I am not. I hate social media. I have nothing to do with it. So we were fighting that battle. There are varying metrics for evaluating the success of a podcast, but generally speaking, according to some sites, a top 25% podcast will have roughly 120 downloads in the first 7 days after an episode is released. So even though people are still downloading episodes now of the entire series, in terms of podcasting metrics, we look at the first 7 days, how many downloads you get that first 7 days. If you have around 400 episodes, you'll be in the top 10%. Top 5% episode podcasts will have thousands downloads, and top 1% will have 5,000 downloads. So of all the thousands of podcasts out there, you're in the top 1% of those podcasts if you have 5,000 downloads in that first week of an episode's release. There was variation between individual episodes, of course, but this, on average, the 7-day average for Magic in the United States was about 3,880 downloads per season, per episode. So somewhere in the top 3%. Podcast categories also largely determine the competition, and these numbers are general overall. So when we were making the podcast, we had to decide which category of podcast was going to go under. Religion and spirituality was one that we floated for a little while because there's less competition, so it's easier to rise to the top of that. But we decided we really needed to anchor this in the humanities scholarship. And so we went with society and culture. There's a documentary category within that. It's a much more competitive category, but we still did really well. Additionally, audience growth over time is an important metric. Our top 5 7-day downloads all are from season 3, with one exception, and demonstrates a significant growth from season 2. In terms of total downloads as of January 1st, our top 7-day downloads are almost all from season 3. The Seer, Stone, and the Prophet, which was 20,000 downloads, Teresita, which was 18,000, The Sorcerer's Saint, 15,000, The Stars Ascending, 12,000, and Montague and Duck from season 2, which was 14,000. The median downloads per episode is between 3,000 and 4,000, although since new downloads are still happening, this number's going to change. All right, so how do you get downloads? How do you reach these broad audiences as academics and scholars who are really busy and we don't want to be social media influencers, we want to be doing research. For better or for worse, advertising and social media are necessary evils when you're trying to get a product in front of a broad audience. So this is true for podcasts, but it's also true for YouTube videos. As might be expected, episodes that received a boost from notable social media influencers did better than others. We got boosts from Thorne Mooney, Corey Hutchison, Dr. Al Cummins, and Jesse Hathaway-Diaz in particular. If you're unfamiliar with the series, I do recommend a couple episodes to start with. Season 1, Episode 1, Seeking American Magic, which frames the series for lay audiences and presents important key concepts, mostly undergraduate religious studies. Yes, key concepts that undergraduate religious studies scholars often encounter in their first classes. So this first episode was probably one of the most important ones for us going in. And since it was one of our earliest episodes, I don't think it's our best, but this is one that I know faculty at other universities use in their undergrad intro to religious studies classes. The next one is The Starry Minos, which is about the life of Eddie Kaczynski I mentioned. This episode also demonstrates how a story can be used to connect the relevance of different topics in humanities research. So in this case, it's sort of the high-level view of the history of Wicca, but then it also gets into the occult and gay scene in New York in the 1970s, the HIV/AIDS crisis and that impact on those communities, and then the core series concept of religious bricolage and remixing. And finally, I recommend Season 3, Episode 4, The Stars Ascending, in part because this episode on the social history of astrology in the US actually reveals some of the key challenges that we face in the series. This episode had a couple big problems up front. First was just narrowing it down. Initially, it was just going to be an episode about the Reagans because it's such a great story. But we realized if we did that, we were kind of missing a lot of the lived practices that kind of surround that and continue on to this day. The next challenge was actually finding scholars looking at specifically social history in the US related to astrology. Like, we were pretty zeroed in on that. We were rich with practitioners who truly are scholars of astrology themselves. And we owe a big debt of favor to a lot of them. But ultimately, we ended up finding some faculty and former faculty at the Sophia Center who were able to talk about aspects of that history. But there was a lot there that I think we probably could have explained better or handled better. I am sure those scholars exist, but where they're publishing, if their publications are getting buried, and honestly, it hurt my national pride that we couldn't faculty in the US who could speak on the social history of astrology in the US. But some listeners were also frustrated that we overlooked important parts of American astrological history or overstated others. And these were absolutely valid criticisms in general. And I think this is where having really readily available current scholarship that's culturally specific would have made it a better episode. So It's hard to pack a lot of information into a 25 to 30-minute episode. Listeners burn out, and the episodes are already quite packed. The intention of the series was to inspire audiences to simply be more curious and to learn more about different religious histories after listening to the episodes. And time will tell if we're successful with that. Aside from this and the recent critiques by evangelical Christian lobbying groups, our feedback's been overwhelmingly positive. Practitioners have generally loved the series, and they've written many kind and wonderful emails over the last 3 seasons, given reviews. The majority of feedback comes in the form of emails, direct messages on social media, and listener reviews. And they've been incredibly supportive and complimentary. But in other cases, there are also non-practitioners who express appreciation for the content. In some cases, I know from private messages that there were spouses of family members of practitioners who appreciated the content targeting them specifically. These were folks who were curious about the practices of people in their lives, loved ones, colleagues, but they weren't interested in being practitioners themselves. And if you do a survey of podcasts that are looking at contemporary practices, a lot of them are either geared towards a more academic understanding of those histories or are geared towards practitioners. Very few are sort of in that middle ground. In other cases, I heard from academics who plan on using specific episodes in their undergraduate courses, another important target audience. Most but not all taught religious studies classes, but several had classes with American studies. As with most mass media projects, the vast majority of audiences listen regularly to the material, appreciate it, value it, but never leave a comment, review it, rate it, or write an email. But anecdotally, I'm continually surprised by the reach of magic in the United States. One of the interview subjects that I reached out to for the Teen Witch episode, when I emailed her to ask if she would talk to me, and I'm explaining the podcast and I have my little pitch, she was like, "Oh, I know your podcast. I've been using them in my classes." So that was really affirming to like cold email an academic or religious studies scholar and find out that they were already using the series. Because it sort of indicates, I don't know how many people are doing the same thing, I just haven't heard from them yet. I would absolutely encourage all scholars to find ways to communicate their research to lay audiences and to make this a regular part of their writing regime. And I know we're all busy guys, but try. Many hands make light work of it, and collaboration is absolutely key here. The biggest challenge in most popular media is standing out enough to get listeners and viewers to build those audiences. And this is true for podcasting, vlogging on YouTube, running Patreons, writing on Medium or Substack, all of it. I hope I've made the case for why it's essential for academics to communicate their research to non-academic audiences. Polarization and ideal bubbles have made disinformation and misinformation increasingly incessant and difficult to dispel. Nature abhors a vacuum. And if we don't communicate our research to extradisciplinary audiences, somebody else is going to fill that void, and it's not going to be accurate. At the same time, talking about magic, mystical, esoteric, or occult practices, especially in broad daylight, is a risky act, as the Family Research Council has reminded me. Academics are vulnerable to the same cultural tensions as any other society, or social society. Those stereotypes about us are dangerous, and it's up to us to address them. One challenge for many of us is that we're so familiar with speaking to academic audiences, and most of us only speak within our disciplines too, that we often don't know how to communicate our research to others. So, because social media loves a numbered list, I've got some suggestions for all of you. I would say go with what's easiest. Podcasting's pretty easy because you don't have to deal with video. Video, however, might be supplanting podcasting as a popular media form. So if you are thinking about, getting up with 2 or 3 buddies in here and doing something about what have you done in your research this week, and then talk about it for lunch too, because that's always good. I would say, just do video, a YouTube vlog. It takes practice talking to non-academic audiences, and it's a lot of work. It's actually much harder sometimes. But you get better at it from doing it. So, my list, and there's a lot of typos in this because I ran out of time editing this, but bear with me. I'll clean it up and give it to her. All right. Your audience is intelligent, well-read, and interested. just assume this, right? Just assume it. If you assume otherwise, they'll see right through your contempt and you've burned a bridge. So I know these are like golden rule things that we learned as children, but man, I gotta be reminded every day sometimes. A topic is not the same as a story. We tend to research topics. Find the story in that topic that reveals something about a lived experience, past, present, or future, and use that story to make that topic relevant to an individual. Topics and humanities research are beautifully always connected back to people in some way, shape, or form. And people are full of stories that are amazing and heartbreaking and beautiful and funny. So find the stories, the human stories in your research. Start with that. And you can use that to weave the scholarship around it. Work in small chunks and tell one story at a time. It took years to learn your discipline. Years. So an audience can only grasp so much in 20 to 30 minutes. Video, keep it to 5 to 10 minutes. I know. So like if you have your 90-minute video, edit it into sessions. Seriously, I'll help you with this. Edit it into like smaller chunks. People will eat it up then. But small chunks. And then audio, 20 to 30 minutes. Keep it short. People are busy and have short attention spans. And they're doing laundry. Like, you know, avoid jargon. Oops, that's not weird. Avoid jargon, but use technical terms and define them every time. This was such a this was such a fun process. My editor was Lucy Perkins. She's an amazing journalist, an amazing writer and editor. First episode, I was talking about transpossession, and she was like, "What's that?" And I had to try to figure out how to explain to this really intelligent journalist, what transpossession is. And she's like, "Okay, we need to say that in like 5 to 10 words." I was like, there was another time. I think it was, oh yeah, and she said we have to explain how it works. We were just talking about that. I don't know. Like a god zaps into somebody's head and they're there, right? That's how it works. So anyway, that's a great example of one of these things where when somebody asks you to explain something you take for granted in your own discipline, it reveals to you entirely new research questions. So there's so much value in that for your own scholarship. Pick someone in your life who matches your target audience and write and speak to that person. Again, explain everything, but never talk down to them. Signpost. Writing for audio is very different than for other media. So circle back to your concepts and signposts. Okay, signposting was, I'm not going to be able to explain that, but in podcasting, you're telling a story, and then sometimes you have to take off a couple minutes to define a term, define something. When you come back to that story, you have to very briefly, in a few words, remind the audience where we left off, because we just went on this little segue. So when I was telling the story about Eddie Kaczynski's life, and then I had to talk about the HIV/AIDS crisis, then I was like, okay, back to Eddie's life. He's made the Minoan Brotherhood. He's got HIV/AIDS, and he dies. This is what happens to the Minoan Brotherhood, and they're still doing great. So anyway, signposting, it's a great concept, but it's very different than how you would write on paper. Marketing is a full-time job. Oh my gosh, if you get a grant, hire somebody. Don't do it yourself. It's not fun. I did all my own graphics on the website, and I was like, what? Marketing team doesn't do that? And they're like, no, they're busy marketing. It's a whole thing. But leverage your relationships with other content creators. So you can, if you're familiar with a podcaster who has a lot of listeners, you can say, hey, do you need a break from your podcast? Can you put one of my episodes on your feed? And then you get a week off, you can work on your next episodes, and then I can hopefully get some new audience. So use your social connections to help with that marketing. And then collaborate with others in similar media and ideas. So if you need a break, do a podcast talk, that's what I was just talking about. And then finally, collaborate across disciplines. I can't stress this enough. I have grown more as an artist and researcher by engaging with content from radically different disciplines, from game design to public health to religious studies and data science. I love academia. Oh my gosh, I'm such a geek for it. I love it. I love that I work at this amazing university where I can just walk across the hall, find somebody in some discipline I didn't even know existed, and learn about the research. take advantage of that. I love this forum and this format that you guys get to do this. This is like the heart of what it means to be in academia, sharing ideas. Get outside of your own research bubble and find out what makes data scientists tick, because it might just relate back to what you're doing. And then finally, ask the question when you're thinking about the content, what's immediate, practical, tangibly relevant to in your research to the woman who works down at the bakery down the street, or to your neighbor, or to, and see my timer, believe it's time, or to somebody who is definitely not affiliated with an academic university, with education, with religion. Talk to that person and make sure you understand what their lived reality is, and then figure out how is your research relevant. It absolutely is. I promise you, every single one of you, what you're doing is important and relevant. The hard part is figuring out how to explain that to someone who doesn't know anything about it. And that's a rich, rich challenge. So there, I think that was it.